afternoon, fellow constitutionalists, and welcome to the Thursday edition of the Dan Clements Show, a Christian political talk show. I'm your host, Dan Clements, your constitutional warrior, fighting for your right just to be an American. It is February 1st, in the year of our Lord 2018. Remember, we're a hyphen-free, PC-free zone. God is still in control, and He does love you. And I am broadcasting from the Hemlock Studios here in the beautiful Central Susquehanna Valley in the great Keystone State. And today we're going to talk about California. And the reason why we're talking about California today is, other than being in the news a lot just because of the governor out there, Jerry Brown, who a lot of people affectionately call Governor Moonbeam, the state has been in the news a lot because of its legislative agenda, let's put it mildly. I don't think there's a wackadoodle idea that has come down the pike that they haven't globbed onto. From sanctuary cities to sanctuary states to saying they're going to keep up with the Paris Climate Accords, which they need to do something about the smog out there, because when I was out there as a truck driver, it was bad. Las Vegas was bad, LA was bad, San Francisco was bad on certain days. I like the countryside. Get out in the countryside. It was a little different from what I'm used to, but it was okay. The San Joaquin Valley, beautiful, beautiful farmland out there. But even that is turning into a desert because of the state not allowing farmers and anybody to reservoir water. So California is going down, downhill fast. It's almost like they're in Georgia overdrive on the downhill, how fast they're going down. They're having businesses moving out left and right. I have had good friends of mine, acquaintances from back in the day when I was at the Conservative Radio Network on Blog Talk Radio. His name's Ken. He moved to Texas. Him and his wife, they picked up, moved to Texas. They're doing very well out in Texas now. There is a conservative moving company that is helping people relocate to states like Texas. And I guess they're doing a fantastic job as far as a fantastic business. But I entitled the show, California is Creating Its Own Poverty. And if I had to sum the whole thing up in one word, it would have to be socialism. California, again, they've implemented so many wackadoodle ideas, it isn't funny. But the one thing that they're very vehement about instituting in California is socialism, from the top down. Government controlling everything. And if you want a good example in America of socialism, besides some of the states up in the Northeast, California has to be leading them in socialistic ideas, the way they divert money from infrastructure infrastructure problems like the Oroville Dam. I believe that's what it was, the Oroville Dam, and the spillway. They diverted money to put into social welfare programs. And mainly a lot of that is being used up by illegal immigrants, which, again, they're a sanctuary state. So in California, there's no such thing as an illegal immigrant. And this is one of those areas in immigration where the state is actually violating federal law, because the Constitution gives the federal government the supremacy when it comes to immigration. We've had the state attorney general out there is threatening to arrest any business owner that cooperates with ICE agents in rounding up folks. And again, we have a duly elected official breaking federal law, violating federal law. And he should be, anybody else, they should be the first ones arrested for breaking federal law. But I digress. We're talking about the poverty. I got some articles I want to get into on the show here, talking about income inequality. And this term just drives me nuts, and I'll talk about that. We'll talk a little bit about why California has the worst poverty rate. And again, if you want to sum it up in one word, it's socialism, but we'll get into a little bit of the nuts and bolts about that. We'll also talk about what happens when you regulate an economy and what it leads to. And then we'll talk a little bit about busting the myths about income inequality, which that's a leftist, regressive, straw dog argument that they always bring up about the income inequality in America and everywhere else. And it just matter of fact, it just bugs me to no end. So Let's get on with the show here, folks. Today's program is being brought to you by one of my affiliate marketers, Castos. You heard me talk about how I've switched everything over on the show from Blog Talk Radio archives over to Castos podcast hosting. It's $15 a month. They migrated over 800 episodes, podcast episodes from Blog Talk Radio over to Castos. I don't have the player up yet. I'm working on trying to integrate that in my front page, but it's a real beautiful player. The player that's on the separate episodes is really easy and functional. They have one-click imports for my audio. Basically, when I'm setting up my show pages for each episode, there is a link at the bottom or a tab you can push, and you can upload your audio from a file on your computer, and it goes into the Castos, and it does everything else. Setting it up for their Castos and that, it populates it into your page, and plus they also have it on a page at Castos where they're hosting it and that. So, and it's a direct WordPress integration, which means if you're on a WordPress site, you just pick out the plug-in and plug it in, and I've never, ever had a problem with that messing up anything on my the Dan Clements Show page, where I have it on Bluehost, and it's a WordPress site, and so I've never had that problem. The only problem I had was trying to, and I'm not really good with this because I haven't studied it a lot, but my RSS feed wasn't working right. I asked if somebody from Castos could help me, and sure enough, they did. And it's in like not even a day. Once he figured out what the problem was, I gave him access to my website so he could go and do some fiddling around with the RSS feed. He got that working. Everything's working great on it. Stitcher's working fine. I can my Gpodder, my podcast aggregator on my computer, found that after I got the new RSS feed working right, found it, downloaded episodes, so I know that's working. I'm waiting for iTunes to tell me if everything's okay on iTunes. So everything's working now with that. So I'm grateful. I'm grateful that that's happening in that. And if you have a podcast, or you're thinking about starting up a podcast and you want to control your RSS feed, and you want to have a good place to host it, and you use a Bluehost site, Castos, they're the folks for you. And like I said, $15 a month is not a bad deal at all for what you get. It really isn't. All right, today's daily Bible reading comes from the book of Matthew, chapter 5, verses 43 through 45. And this is Jesus talking. You have heard that was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemies. But I say to you, love your enemies and bless those that curse you. Do good to those that hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. The Bible departs totally away from most philosophies about treating your enemies, how to treat your enemies. And the Bible says we are to love our enemies. We are to love them, bless them, do good to them, pray for them. It drives them nuts. It does. It drives them nuts when you do that, folks. But this is very biblical. This is a biblical thing, and this is something that I believe God wants us to do in the end. And this is something that'll make your life better, and you might even convert some of your enemies over to your ideology. So today's quote meal comes from C.H. von Bogatsky. The most glorious promises of God are generally fulfilled in such a wondrous manner that he steps forth to save us at a time when there is the least appearance of it. Let me read that again. The most glorious promises of God are generally fulfilled in such a wondrous manner that he steps forth to save us at a time when there is the least appearance of it. Good quote there. Good quote. Today's short Bible lesson, and I'm not going to get into it much, but I would appreciate if you actually go over and read this. And it's not from a normal source. This actually comes from cnsnews.com, and it's entitled "The Book of Acts." Through a CT scan, Understanding the Bible Could Change Our World by Eric Metaxas. He posted this January 31st, 2018. And basically what they've done is they found an old Bible that's a Coptic version of a Bible that was written well before most other manuscripts that we know of. And but they're afraid to open it up. And so this guy was using a CT scan in some artificial intelligence programs, and he's able to decipher some of what's, and mainly out of the book of Acts, but he's able to decipher that. And I'm just wondering, they're still checking out to find out, more history about this. But I got into a discussion a few days ago, I guess it was, with the Mormon about the Bible, and he felt that once the apostles said what they had to say, we didn't have anything from the Bible until they put it together at the Council of Nicene, I think it was, or one of those councils where they actually canonized what we have today as the Bible. And I said, well, that's factually incorrect, and it's logically incorrect, because Paul and the other apostles, they wrote their letters, they were copied and sent out to the other churches. And there's no reason to expect that the other churches didn't make more copies of those so families could have, or they could give them to other folks when they were asked. Just to me, it's to believe that they didn't do that's a logical fallacy, because they loved God's word so much they would have wanted to make sure that at least the New Testament epistles and the Gospels and that were they were able to take them with them so they could sit down and study them and talk with folks about the New Testament epistles. And I'm almost sure they had access to the Torah, the Old Testament, through the Jews. But, that was a discussion we have, and I think it's great that we keep finding these the older the manuscript, the better it is. And the Bible is not understanding the Bible could change the world. Understanding the Bible does change the world. Trust me, folks, when I tell you that. Okay, let's get into talking about what we're gonna yap about today. And again, this is about California, and this is about income inequality, now worse than Mexico's, poverty level highest in America. And this is from the nationaleconomist.com, written by Spencer P. Morrison, and this was written on the 17th of January 2018. Were California a country, it'd be the 17th most unequal nation on earth, ahead of Mexico and Guatemala. Now, the last article we're going to talk about today is about income inequality, which I think is a bunch of hokum. And I'll explain to you why, it doesn't bother me to have income inequality. Californians love sermonizing on the plight of America's poor and disenfranchised. If only penny-pinching Republicans would shell out for a bigger welfare state, then all our problems would be solved. Why not build more homes for the homeless or invest in better education for our kids? The state can solve the problem of poverty, they argue. And to be fair, they put their money where their mouth is. Over the last few decades, California has built one of America's most lavish welfare states. There's just one problem: it's not working. The sad truth of the matter is that California's poverty rate is the highest in the country at 20.6%. This is based on data from the U.S. Census Bureau and modified so as to account for differences in the cost of living between states. If you're a skeptical progressive, then don't worry. Even PolitiFact confirms this finding. As bad, excuse me. As bad as that sounds, perhaps the more embarrassing statistic is that income inequality in California is at an all-time high. This should be obvious to anyone who's actually been to California and seen the proliferation of tent cities and urban slums. Inequality can be encapsulated in a number called the Gini coefficient, GC. 0 is perfect equality, where everyone earns the same income, while 1 is perfect inequality, where one individual earns everything, leaving none for anyone else. Importantly, a higher GC means more inequality. In California, the GC is 0.488. This is the second highest of all American major states, behind only New York, and it's also far higher than the national average of 0.479, which is inflated by absurdly high GCs from the large liberal states like California and New York. But it's only when looking at the global context do you really get a sense of how bad it is. If California were an independent country, it would be the 17th most unequal country on earth according to data from the World Bank. It would rest comfortably just behind the Honduras at 0.511 and ahead of Guatemala 0.487 and Mexico 0.482. Now compare this to the other social democracies that California is want to compare itself with. Canada sits at a spot number 111, while Norway is way down the list at number 153 out of 176 countries. Okay, so Canada's 111th. I wish he'd write these things better. California's 111th, and Norway is 153rd out of 176 countries for the better coefficients there. In terms of inequality, California has more in common with banana republics than the social democracies it emulates. Perhaps they should get their own house in order before lecturing the rest of us on the benefits of socialism. Now, again, this is one of the tenets of socialism that drives people to want to have socialism is income inequality. And again, income inequality is a straw dog argument. And it honestly doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. And like I said, we'll get to that here in a little bit. The next article here is why California has the nation's worst poverty rate, and this is from Ryan McMacken over at Mises.org. I'll get this right here in a second. Earlier this week, the LA Times, and this was posted on the 17th of last month also, so this is fairly recent. Earlier this week, the LA Times reminded its readers that California has the highest poverty rate in the nation, specifically when using the Census Bureau's most recent supplemental poverty measure, SPM. California clocks in a poverty rate at 20%, which places it as the worst in the nation. And so let me see here. This is the one here I wanted you to see. Supplemental poverty measured by percent. Now, the average United States is 14.7. I think Pennsylvania is down on that list pretty good. But California, if we go up here, let's go from New York on up. New York is sitting at 16, Georgia 16.1, Mississippi 16.9, Arizona 17.8, Louisiana 18.4. Florida has the second highest poverty rate in the country at 18.8, and then California at 20.4. Now, to be fair, California and Florida are very desirable places for homeless people, and especially if you're poor, because although it does get hot there in both states, they're less likely to die from heat as they are from freezing to death in other climates. So that's a huge attraction there. I mean, that's just anecdotal, but still, it's a huge attraction for these folks. And then the other one, this is just a map of the country here, supplemental poverty measure, and you just shaded the lowest to the highest. We're right in like the fourth percentile, second above the lowest. But if you go from the highest down, we're in the fourth percentile. California, New York, Florida, all those, and then you got the other second highest ones. Texas is another state with a high poverty rate, but again, there's a lot of dynamics going on there. You can't just blame the government down there because they have a fairly conservative government, low, no income tax. Decent cost of living, not the lowest in the nation. I think Tennessee's lower than they are, but still low. But they do have favorable weather, so that does attract poorer folks because, again, there's ways to cool down. It doesn't cost you anything, but to heat a place, that's a different story. Okay, so we have this story here, and there's another picture of that graph there. This continues to be something of a black eye for California politicians who imagine themselves to be the enlightened elite of North America. The fact that 1 in 5 Californians is below the poverty line doesn't exactly lend itself to crowing about the state's success in its various wars on poverty. Many conservative sites have seized on the information to say, I told you so, and claim this shows that blue state policies fail. One should be careful with this, of course, since there are plenty of red states in the top 10 as well. Moreover, some blue states like Massachusetts are doing moderately well with this measure. And again, I know this is just, it's not scientific, but I think a lot of that has to do with the climate up in the Northeast. Now, New York is an outlier because a lot of their poverty happens in the big cities like New York City and Albany and possibly Buffalo. But there's a lot of poverty in New York City, a lot of homeless people in New York City. I don't know why they gravitate there unless they have a really good welfare state there. In the realm of political punditry, though, it matters a great deal whether one is using the regular poverty measure or the SPM. For one, in the regular poverty measure, California ranks better than Texas, and leftists love to use that standard poverty rate to talk about how truly awful Texas and other red states are. The supplemental poverty measure allows Texans to talk about how awful California is. If we're going to use census data to guess the prevalence of low-income households, though, the SPM is greatly superior to the old poverty rate. There's a reason, after all, that the Census Bureau developed it, and the Bureau has long warned that poverty rates using the old measure don't make for good comparisons across state lines. The old poverty measure was far more crude measure that did not take local cost into account, did not include poverty assistance income, and basically ignored what can be immense differences in the cost of living in different locations. Many commentators often love to note how the median household income in many red states are below the national average, but then conveniently ignore how low the cost of living is in those places. Remember that, folks. The SPN, on the other hand, takes into account the cost of food, clothing, shelter, and utilities, and a small additional amount to allow for other needs. It includes government benefits, but also subtracts taxes. And they have a link to a full explanation, and it gets kind of in depth on that link if you want to go check that out. That'll be on the show notes page after I get this show posted. The end result shouldn't really be all that surprising. Once we take into account the actual cost of living, including taxes, we find that poverty is actually quite high in California. How to alleviate poverty? There's only two ways to reduce poverty and increase the standard of living: increase household income and lower the cost of living. That makes sense, right? Poverty can be alleviated by simply increasing income, or it can be done by simply reducing the cost of living. Ideally, both things happen at once, and fortunately, that's usually how it works. The greatest reduction in global poverty has come about due to a spread of capital and industrial production methods. This is because better and more widespread use of capital leads to two things. One, it increases household income by increasing worker productivity. That is, each worker can produce more stuff of higher value. This means each worker can take home a higher income. And two, when we produce more stuff more quickly, the stuff becomes more affordable. Thanks to labor saving or more efficient machinery, for example, fewer people can make more cars more quickly. In turn, more people can afford more cars because cars are more plentiful and less expensive. Over time, more people can buy more stuff and lower prices, thus increasing their standard of living. Even better, thanks to modern capital, those people can also produce more during the hours they work, making it possible to buy even more stuff. Both pieces work together to increase living standards. One of the biggest problems California is facing right now, though, is that government intervention into the marketplace are making it harder and harder to produce more stuff, thus driving up prices. The end result is higher cost of living and thus more poverty. Jerry Jackson at the LA Times notes, and he goes on to talk about what we were just talking about here in the as far as the poverty in that. You can go read that too. It is increasingly becoming common knowledge that California is notoriously bad in terms of the cost of housing. Every time a new top 10 list of least affordable housing markets is published, California cities often dominate the top of the list. In this list, for example, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Jose, and San Diego are in the top 10. Housing is perhaps the poster child for the impossibility of getting ahead in California. Much This is due to locally based NIMBYism, in which local governments actively intervene to reduce new housing construction for the sake of preserving the character of the neighborhoods. This is just another way of saying rich people like things the way they are, so poor people can just get lost. We're not building any more housing. Those same rich people then later pat themselves on the back for voting Democrat and doing something about poverty. But it's not just local regulations. As Jackson notes, environmental regulations are especially burdensome on businesses, thus driving up the cost of everything. This is especially true of housing, which requires land, water resources, and visibly impacts the local environment. These regulations, mind you, are all imposed on top of an already existing federal regulation, and in addition to the environmental regulations that already function with a lower burden to businesses in other states. Coloradans, for example, aren't exactly living in rivers of toxic sludge in spite of having fewer environmental regulations and cheaper housing. Nor is housing the only industry impacted by these regulations. Mountains of anti-business regulations in the state also make it harder to start new businesses, hire people, and cover the basic cost of expanding worker productivity. Fewer workers get hired, less capital is deployed to workers. The end result is that worker productivity growth can't keep up with the increase of the cost of living. Poverty results. Recognizing this vice in which the poor are caught in California, the response is always the same: more rent control, more regulations, more costly hoops for employers to jump through. We're taming capitalism, the politician tells themselves. Unfortunately, they've driven a fifth of the population into poverty in the process. But don't expect things to improve for the poor in California anytime soon. California perhaps is the single biggest example in the U.S. of how stylish locales become playgrounds for the rich and a treadmill to nowhere for everyone else. In recent years, news outlets have carried a number of articles on how workers in Silicon Valley are living in their cars. Sometimes the homeless even have jobs at big tech firms like Facebook. Nearly all these homeless people have jobs of some sort though. Thanks to the ruling class California, though, a basic apartment is $3,000 per month, while food and groceries aren't exactly cheap. The well-to-do tell themselves that the high cost of living is simply the cost of doing business, for living in such a wonderful place with so many enlightened, intelligent, beautiful people. People can go to the beach whenever they want, and life is wonderful. Of course, anyone who has actually lived in California as a non-wealthy person knows that one most certainly can't go to the beach whenever they want if one is working 2 jobs to pay the rent. A day at the beach after sitting in traffic and paying the parking isn't exactly a regular event. Moreover, the communities with non-sky-high rents are generally found well inland and aren't exactly next to Malibu. This may help explain why, as the Sacramento Bee reported last year, California is exporting its poor to Texas. The beaches aren't as nice in Texas, but many of those migrants are trading in the beaches, which they never saw anyway, for an affordable apartment. And this, again, there's a huge exodus going on, not only of businesses, but more importantly of people that's going on in California. Now, this brings me to a point that we really need to make here. And it's an article called "A Regulated Economy Leads to a Socialistic Economy," or Socialist Economy. And this is actually by Ludwig von Mises, who the Mises Institute is named after. This was posted, and he's dead, but this is like a repost of what he said a long time ago. What is interventionism? Interventionism means that the government does not restrict its activity to the preservation of order, or as people used to say 100 years ago, to the production of security. Interventionism means that the government wants to do more. It wants to interfere with the market phenomena. If one objects and says the government should not interfere with businesses, people very often answer, but the government necessarily always interferes. If there are policemen on the street, the government interferes. If it interferes with a robber looting a shop, or it prevents a man from stealing a car. But when dealing with interventionism and defining what is meant by intervention, we are speaking about government interference with the market. that the government and the police are expected to protect the citizens, which include businessmen, and of course their employees against attacks on the part of a domestic or foreign gangster is in fact a normal, necessary expectation of any government. Such protection is not intervention, for the government's only legitimate function is precisely to produce security. What we have in mind when we talk about interventionism is the government's desire to do more than prevent assaults and fraud. Interventionism means that the government not only fails to protect the smooth functioning of the market economy, but it interferes with the various market phenomena. It interferes with prices, with wages, rates, interest rates, and profits. The government wants to interfere in order to force businessmen to to conduct their affairs in a different way than they would have chosen if they obeyed only the customers. Thus, all the measures of interventionism by the government are directed towards restricting the supremacy of consumers. The government wants to aggregate to itself the power, or at least part of the power, which in the free market economy is in the hands of the consumers. Let us consider one example of interventionism, very popular in many countries and tried again and again by many governments, especially in times of inflation. I refer to price control. I'm going to stop reading here. If you remember, back in the 70s during the oil embargo and people running out of gasoline and stuff like that, and President Nixon freezing prices, doing a price control on a lot of stuff. That's very damaging to an economy. Well-intentioned, but wrong-headed. All right, well, let's read on here. Governments usually resort to price control when they have inflated the money supply and people have begun to complain about the resulting rise in prices. There are many famous historical examples of price control methods that failed, but I shall refer to only two of them because in both these cases the governments were really very energetic in enforcing and trying to enforce their price controls. The first famous example is in the case of the Roman Emperor Diocletian, very well known as the last Roman emperors who persecuted the Christians. The Roman Empire in the second part of the 3rd century had only one financial method, and it was currency debasement. In those primitive ages, before the invention of the printing press, even inflation was, let's say, primitive. It involved debasement of the coinage, especially the silver. The government mixed more and more copper into the silver until the color of the silver coins was changed and the weight was reduced considerably. The result of this coinage debasement and the associated increase in the quantity of money was an increase in prices, followed by an edict to control prices. The Roman emperors were not very mild when they enforced the law. They did not consider death too mild a punishment for a man who was asked for a higher price. They enforced price control, but they failed to maintain the society, the result of the disintegration of the Roman Empire and the system of the division of labor. Then 1,500 years later, the same currency debasement took place during the French Revolution. But this time a different method was used. The technology for producing money was considerably improved. It was no longer necessary for the French to resort to debasement of the coinage. They had printing presses, and the printing press was very efficient. Again, the result was an unprecedented rise in prices. But in the French Revolution, maximum prices were not enforced by the same method of capital punishment with the Roman Emperor Diocletian had used. There had also been an improvement in the technique of killing citizens. You know where this is going, right, folks? You all remember the famous Dr. J.I. Guillotine, right? 1738 to 1814, who advocated the use of the guillotine. Despite the guillotine, the French also failed with their laws on maximum prices. When Robespierre himself was carried off to the guillotine, the people shouted, "There goes the dirty maximum." I wanted to mention these because people often say what is needed in order to make price control effective and efficient is merely more brutality, more energy. Now, certainly Diocletian was very brutal, and so was the French Revolution. Nevertheless, price control measures in both ages failed entirely. Now let us analyze the reason for this failure. The government hears people complain that the price of milk has gone up, and milk is certainly very important, especially for the rising generation for children. Consequently, the government declares a maximum price for milk, a maximum price that is lower than the potential market price would be. Now the government says, certainly we have done everything needed in order to make it possible for poor parents to buy as much milk as they need to feed their children. Now I'm going to stop the reading here. In Pennsylvania, we have a minimum price control on milk. There's a minimum that can be charged. It can't, even if the market supply is higher, you can only go so low on the prices, which doesn't benefit the consumer either. I think it's bad both ways when you control prices. I think the market weeds out bad players, even in farms and the dairy industry. You know, some inefficient players out there are benefiting from these artificially kept up prices and that. But I digress. Let me read on here. But what happens? On the one hand, the lower price of milk increases demand for milk. People who could not afford to buy milk at a higher price are now able to buy it at the lower price, which the government has decreed. And on the other hand, some of the producers, those producers of milk who are producing at the highest cost, that is, the marginal producers, are now suffering losses because the price which the government has decreed is lower than their cost. This is the important point in the market economy. The private entrepreneur, the private producer, cannot take losses in the long run, as he cannot take losses in milk. He restricts the production of milk for the market. He may sell some of his cows for the slaughterhouse, or instead of milk, he may sell some products made out of milk, for instance, sour cream, butter, or cheese. Thus the government's interference with the price of milk will result in less milk than there was before, and at the same time, there will be a greater demand. Some people who are prepared to pay for the government decreed price cannot buy it. Another result will be that anxious people will hurry to be first to the shops. They have to wait outside. The long lines of people waiting at shops always appears as a familiar phenomenon in a city in which the government has decreed maximum prices for commodities that the government considers as important. This has happened everywhere when the price of milk was controlled. This was always prognosticated by economists. Of course, only sound economists, and their number is not very great. You know, this thing about having price controls. I'm not going to read the rest of this. He keeps going on in greater detail, but it gives you a flavor about what we're talking about when it comes to regulated economies always lead to socialism. And all socialism is. Fascism is the first rung to communism. Fascism is the government control, but not ownership, of industry and agriculture and that. Socialism is the actual government control and ownership of the means of production. And then communism is not only the ownership of the means of production and the control of it, but also the control of the people who work for these industries that the government controls now. That's total communism. That's total control. Now, I want to get back to this point about income inequality, because this is what socialists in California always complain about. This is what progressives, or I should say regressives in this country, like Bernie Sanders, that's one of his talking points, is income inequality. Oh, how terrible, how bad. And it's like, I never understood it. Even before I began studying economics, I never understood what the big deal was about income inequality, because if I went out and worked and and earned $1 for the day, and someone down the street went and worked the same 8-hour day, maybe for somebody else, and earned $5, that's what Bernie Sanders and socialists and regressives talk about as far as income inequality. Well, this guy made $5 for the day. I only made $1 a day. There's an inequality there. And what they're talking about is inequality of outcomes. Now, maybe I'm working in a different job than he is, and I probably am. Maybe my job doesn't demand as many skills as his jobs does. Maybe his job demands more skills, and then therefore, if it demands more skills, whatever they're producing, a good or service, is actually worth more to the public than the goods and service I might be producing. Or maybe I just didn't want to go to school and get the learning I did, whether it's a trade school or college, in order to get that $5 a day job. And I just came out of high school and decided I'd just figure out how I'm going to do this on my own. And I'm only worth to my employer $1 a day. But yet socialists like Bernie Sanders will still scream about the income inequality. Now, that guy making $5 a day didn't steal nothing from me. Didn't take nothing out of my mouth, nothing out of my hand, nothing. Did nothing wrong. And because he makes $5 an hour or more, that's no skin off my teeth. I don't care. I'm happy for him if he's doing that. But the left, the socialists in this country, the socialists around the world, has got it into poor people's heads that this is wrong, that you're being stolen from. The Trump tax cuts, right? The regressive left, oh, this is a scam. They're stealing from the middle class. They're stealing from the poor to give the taxes to the rich. Well, that's a bunch of hokum. Because the rich aren't paying their fair share of taxes, which, again, who left them arbiter of what is or is not fair? My taxes are reduced. Business taxes are reduced, which means the goods and services that they sell to the public will come down in prices because of that reduction. My standard of living goes up because my cost of living went down. And so I'm supposed to be mad about that? I'm supposed to say this is a scam? Because with them, it's a zero-sum game. And we talked about this a little bit with these logical fallacies. In a zero-sum game, one team's going to win, one team's going to lose. And one team's going to win, say football, it's got the Super Bowl coming up. One team's going to win by denying the other team scoring opportunities. They're literally taking away scoring opportunities. And in games, that's okay. That's the point of a game. You got to have a winner and loser, and in order to be a winner, as long as you're not breaking the rules like the Patriots have in the past, it's okay to do that. But then they extrapolate that out. Again, the fallacy of comparisons. Well, if this happens in games, this is what's happening in life too. That somebody is stopping somebody else from earning more of an income. So that's why we have income inequality. It's a zero-sum game. And that's just not right. Because there's not people out there actively, I mean, we're talking about institutionally on a grand national scale, there's not groups of people out there actively trying to stop me from earning a living, unless it's the socialists out there, because maybe I'm making too much. But if you even take it down to the individual level, there's not people out there stopping you from making a living or making as much money as you want. There just isn't. And this is where this whole talking about the income inequality. And Chelsea Follett over at the Foundation for Economic Education has an article here. It was written back January 21st in 2016, Busting Myths About Income Inequality. And the reason why they wrote this back then, I'm almost sure, is because Bernie Sanders had his hat in the ring or either in the ring, or he was talking about becoming president. And this is one of his talking points, is income inequality. And people don't stop to think about what he's saying. They just, yeah, that sounds like a good argument. He's right. Let's go, pitchforks and torches. Let's go get them rich people. They're stealing from us. When they're not. She writes in here, politicians speak often about income inequality, but that doesn't mean they're well informed. Indeed, they propagate 4 myths about the issue. And I'm just going to go over the 4 myths real quick here, and because I'm getting long in this video here. 1, most often those vying for elected office describe income inequality as static, as though the people who make up each income group do not change. The top 1% or the top 10% of income earners are portrayed as exclusive clubs that seldom accept new members, or see old and current members leave. No fluidity, no change. That's a myth. That's a myth. At 50% of the population here in America, income, people that work, at one time or other in their lives are in the top 1% or top 10%. It's very fluid, and they go in and out of that throughout their lives. Two, political figures also have a tendency only to blame income inequality on factors like trade, immigration, and insufficiently high minimum wage, inadequate taxes on the wealthy, or the vague concept of greed. Three, they typically ignore the sizable role of choices under an individual's control. And four, they downplay the role of regressive government regulations. So those are the four myths she deals with. I want you to go over and read that. But those, to me, those are so easy to knock over. Like I said, income groups are not static. They never have been, never will be. But in order for Bernie Sanders' arguments, I'll just use Bernie since he's the most recent example of this. He uses this quite a bit. But he's factually incorrect. And I'm not even talking about tweaking the facts. He's outright lying about it. Because these groups are fluid, very fluid. And they often talk about this where they, the second point about political figures have always had the tendency to blame income inequality on factors like trade, immigration, insufficiently high minimum wage, inadequate taxes on the wealthy, and the vague concept of greed. I think, and I don't think I'm exaggerating about this, I think the greediest people in America are guys like Bernie Sanders and his followers, his acolytes. They are some of the most greediest people that you're ever going to see because they don't want to go out and make it on their own. They want to take it from somebody else to give it to them. Again, they look at things from a zero-sum game, that someone's stopping them from earning a living. And then Bernie Sanders totally ignores the choices that individuals make. College students, one of the biggest choices you can make is getting into a field that where you're going to be able to make a decent living. Not a liberal arts degrees where you major in women's studies. That's not going to translate into a payable job for you, I'm sorry. It just isn't. So a lot of it has to do with people's choices. A lot of it has to do with people's get up and go. Their initiative, their drive. Some people have more of a drive than other people. So they're going to do better in life. Some people are better organized. Some people, there's a lot of differences in folks, and a lot of it has to do with choices we make. But the fourth one is the biggest one, I believe, is how they downplay the regressive government regulations. President Trump has been cutting regulations, and that's helping the economy too, other than the tax. If we cut enough regulations, it's really going to unleash the economy in this country. But yet, you have socialists like Bernie Sanders, and here's a guy that has never seen a regulation he didn't like, and he gets mad when people cut regulations. Oh, we're gonna harm people. We got to protect people from themselves. Well, how about we let people decide that for themselves? Oh, we can't do that. People aren't smart enough. Oh, we can't say that. And that's if Bernie Sanders was totally honest. I watched some of these trailers on YouTube, honest trailers. If Bernie Sanders was really honest, that's what he would say. People aren't smart enough to take care of themselves, so we, the government, have to take care of them for them. We have to make these decisions for them. That's exactly what he's saying. Students aren't smart enough to know whether they can afford to go to college or not, so we're going to make the decision for them. We're going to make it so cheap and easy for them to go to college that everybody will have a degree. And yet, they don't stop to think about how colleges actually weed out the ones that really shouldn't be there. And how they downplay trade schools, which trade schools I think actually prepare people better for life than colleges do. I believe that. I think getting a college education on the side of a trade is okay. And for certain professions, I do want them to have college training. Like my doctor, I want him to have a little bit of schooling, if you know what I mean. My accountant, the same way. Want to have him or her have a little bit of schooling. But my welder, I want him to go to trade school. I don't want him to go to college to learn to weld. I want him to go get hands-on training in a trade school, because then I'll trust his welding. Because in college, all he's going to get is theory, welding theory, and trade school is going to get hands-on. See what I'm saying, folks? It's just, it's no more difficult than that. It's no more difficult than that. So again, it just amazes me It really does. It amazes me how folks will listen to Bernie Sanders types, not think with the gray matter between their heads, and not put two and two together and think, you know, what he's saying doesn't add up. And it never does. It sounds good. Oh, I'm going to give you all this free stuff. But free isn't free. Somebody has to pay for it. Somebody has to pay for it. It's just like free health care. Somebody has to pay for that. And it's usually through taxes, and it's usually through your nose. When that when that happens, it's usually through your nose with these taxes, folks. All right, folks, that's the end of the show. Hopefully I gave you a lot of information that you can take away and think about. Please visit my show notes page over to danclementshow.com and read more of these articles and get more links out of these articles. This has been the Dan Clements Show. I'm your host, Dan Clements, your constitutional warrior. Remember, if you aim at nothing, you hit it every time. Have a great rest of the day, folks, and God bless, and we'll see you on the next video.